Maybe
Okay.
tomorrow. So the Torah says that one does not have to rule a line for each and every line. And a little further down, he says, if he wants to make sirtut, he has permission to do so. And then he finishes up by saying, someone who doesn't know how to straighten the line without sirtut, in other words, to write a straight line without sirtut, it's good that he makes sirtut to make the writing straight. So, just to point out in the Torah expresses three levels. That the basic din is that you don't need to make sirtut on each and every line. But if you want to, you can. And if you can't make your line straight without sirtut, then it's good. It would seem like it's recommended that you do the sirtut. So we'll see now in the Beit Yosef, he's going to break this down into the various parts that are being expressed. So we'll start here. He doesn't have to make sirtut on each and every line. So the Beit Yosef, he says this is brought down in Perek Sheni de Megillah, Perek HaKometz, that what? V'hilchot tefillin lo bal sirtut. The conclusion of the Gemara is that tefillin do not need sirtut. The Katav HaRambam b'Perek Rishon of tefillin halacha yud bet shahatam lefi shehem mechupin. The reason that they don't have to have sirtut is because they're covered. That is, the parshiot get put into batim, the batim are sewn up, and min hadin, you never have to look at them again. So, unlike Sefer Torah, which you read on a regular basis, and even mezuzah, where there's a din that you have to open and look at it twice in 7 years. But there's no such din by tefillin, and so you don't have to do the sirtut. So the implication, and I think we mentioned this in an earlier shir, the implication of the Rambam is that dafka because you don't see the parshiot, you don't have to be as careful, or we're not as concerned that the writing is straight. Seem to be, yeah?
I thought the reason why we have sirtut for mezuzah is halacha l'Moshe Sinai, but here we're giving a practical explanation for it.
That's a very good point. Yeah, so mezuzah.
Not that those are in conflict, but just in terms of the.
No, you're right though to point it out. What we find out as we go through, and we'll see more as we get into the Beit Yosef, is that in fact the two things that we know have to have sirtut are mezuzah and Megillah, because those things are expressed specifically in the Gemara, and the basis for that. The basis for that is it's a little bit unclear, and for tefillin, I think we saw a little bit of the sugya that dealt with tefillin. There is a day on the Gemara that actually tefillin do need sirtut, but the conclusion is that they don't. Sefer Torah is actually a machloket between Rishonim, mainly Rabbeinu Tam, and other Rishonim about whether Sefer Torah needs sirtut. So I think let's let's hold on though to your point, and I think we might be able to clarify that a little bit more as we go. The other thing I wanted to point out is that the implication of the Rambam seems to be that, as I said, that since you don't have to look at this, they're written and put away, then we don't have to be as concerned about how they look. And there's just a second. I'll just point out that the Orach Chaim in Siman Lamed Bet, Sif Yud Chet, just digress on this for a bit. V'dasha Rambam Katab Rishon Din Yud Bet Halacha L'Moshe Misinai Shen Sefer Torah V'lo Mezuzah Ela B'Sirtut Al Tefillin Einam Tzrichim Sirtut L'fi Shein Mechupim Ad Kam Leshono Klomar Shein Nir'in La'ayin HaKoreh K'Sefer Torah Mezuzah. So he's explaining the Rambam, right, that we just read. He says, since they're not seen by the eye of the reader, the way a Sefer Torah or mezuzah, Shabbat Kinotan Lifrakim, that mezuzah at least we have to check from time to time. V'im yichtov be'ikum yiru hakol. And if you write them crooked, that is, if you write the Sefer Torah mezuzah crooked, then everyone will see. About tefillin einam nirim, the tefillin are not seen. So we're not worried if they're written crooked. So, okay, I'm going to leave the rest of the Aruch HaShulchan for now. What's interesting to me about that is that we saw earlier, I believe from the Mordechai, that he seems to say something conceptually the opposite, which is that just like the Kodashim was gold, right? The inside of the Mishkan was so nobody saw the Kodesh HaKodashim except for the Kohen Gadol, the Yom Kippurim. Nonetheless, it was made out of gold, and it was mehudar, right? It had this kind of, that's not exactly the language he used, but it has, that's the implication. And that seems to be in class, and that's why, you're supposed to write a ktav yafeh. You're supposed to write everything to be very beautiful. And this din of the Rambam that understands sirtut, that you don't need sirtut in tefillin, seems to go against that. So I'm just pointing it out. It's a little bit strange to me. I didn't see anybody who commented on it, but for our purposes, like for practical halachic purposes, as we'll see in any event, we nowadays do sirtut. Everybody sirtut, and we try to make them as beautiful as possible. So we'll leave that for a moment, and we'll come back to the issue of the mezuzah forthwith. Okay, V'tanya b'hakometz, right? We were in the Gemara in Menachot. Sefer Torah Shabbalah, u'tefillin Shabbalu, eino sim mehen mezuzah, lefi she'en moridim miktusha chamura lektusha kala. So Sefer Torah that got worn out, or tefillin that got worn out, possibly frayed. In other words, they're not going to be necessarily used anymore. Nonetheless, the enosin mehen mezuzah, you don't make a mezuzah from them. Since you don't bring something down that had a more stringent kedusha to a lighter kedusha. So what does it mean, enosin mehen mezuzah? What's the implication? What? What does that mean that for Torah or tefillin you don't make a mezuzah from them? what's the simple meaning?
Sorry, I was muted. I was trying to talk.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is pshat, but that you can't, cut out the pieces of a Sefer Torah and then turn it into a mezuzah.
Yeah, that's the pshat. In other words, you don't take the parshiot that are in the Sefer Torah or the parshiot that are in the tefillin and cut them out and make them into mezuzah. And the reason that the Gemara is because ein moridim kedusha chamura kedusha kala. You don't take something of a kedusha like Sefer Torah or tefillin, which are both have higher kedusha than mezuzah, and use something that's a kedusha kala. That's the reason that the Breita there gives. And we'll look at the Breita. Look at the Breita now. Actually, I think we'll just go straight to the Breita.
Something I've thought about even early on in my studies was the halacha of Kesidron and K'tiv Atama. So it only applies by mezuzah and tefillin, and not by Sefer Torah. Now that I know the reasons behind that are not related to kedusha, and obviously Sefer Torah is more kadosh than tefillin and mezuzah, but in a certain sense, the writing of tefillin and mezuzah is, you have to be more careful, and it's more stringent in a lot of ways. So how can you just say, oh, it's easier when it comes to the kedusha compared to a Sefer Torah?
So I would, right. It's a good point, and it's a good question, and it is a question. In other words, if Sefer Torah has the highest kedusha, then we would expect that we're going to be more machmir about the attendant halachot. So how could it be that we're not as machmir about Sefer Torah as we are about tefillin and mezuzah? So there's a tshuva of the Radvaz. I'll try to bring it this time, but I believe he says essentially that he gives us practical reason. He said, well, if we were to be makbid on Kesidron for Sefer Torah, we would never have a kosher Sefer Torah because it would be too much of a challenge.
Right.
That's one way of answering it. My own personal take on it is a little bit different, and it doesn't necessarily fully answer the question, but I answer it by saying that tefillin and mezuzah, for certain practical purposes, right, they have a lower kedusha than Sefer Torah, but they are set apart because of this Bahayu Bahavayatan Yehu, which I think we touched on once, back to eventually. So there's something about tefillin and mezuzah that makes them different, that they have to be the havayatan, they have to be in their existence in this, and the implication of that is that they have to be written in this chronological way. By contrast, when we talk about Torah, and even though we didn't necessarily think of this in terms of K'tivat Sefer Torah, but we have this notion of Torah that ein muhuchar b'Torah, that no earlier or late in the Torah, and there's a machlokas rishonim about exactly what that means. Does it mean that the Torah was entirely written in chronological order? In other words, that the narrative is entirely logical, except where the Torah goes its way to tell you that it's not? Or does it mean that lav dafka, that there's certain parts of the Torah that were written, that the narrative was written out of chronological order? So I can give you a little bit of a separate shiur on that, but the point is that Torah, the whole of the Torah, is not fixed chronologically in the same way that these parts of the Torah are. There's a qualitative difference conceptually between Torah and tefillin and mezuzah. It includes Sefer Torah, in other words, the actual written Sefer Torah. It's important important to understand that I'll put it in a slightly different way. That the idea that Ein Mukdam U'Mauchar B'Torah, the idea of that, I think, implies that there's actually a simultaneity to the Torah, that it all exists all at once, and that's why it's, it refers to itself back and forth in different ways and in different places. It's laid out in a kind of a funny way. Whereas tefillin and mezuzot are ktsuvot, like they are singular parts that are being written for a very specific purpose, and that purpose is to fulfill their respective mitzvot of laying tefillin and putting the mezuzah in your door, and they reflect something about those parts of the Torah, but they're not a reflection of the entire Torah in the same way that an entire actual Sefer Torah is. So, all of that to say, maybe I'll give a separate shiur on that one time where I put that together a bit better form. But I think it's a good point. The thing that I thought you were going to say, which some Rishonim talk about, is here in the sugya. You could also say, if Sefer Torah doesn't have to be written kesidran, so then surely you can't make a mezuzah from it, right? Because we don't know that the Torah was written kesidran. How would I ever think that I could take the parshiot out of it and make that a mezuzah? They weren't written kesidran. But that leads actually into some interesting discussion about the notion of kesidran. And the last thing I'll say about this, because it was a topic for today, and it will come up, of course, later in Siman Lamed Bet about kesidran, is the idea of kesidran it's mentioned, I think we touched on it, and it's mentioned in Hilta, and it's not actually expressly mentioned in the Gemara, and it's not clear exactly what kesidran means. In other words, the way we hold halacha l'maaseh is that every single letter has to be written in order, one after the other. But actually, based on the notion that I just told you, there are deot that say that actually just the parshiot have to be written unto themselves in order. But it wrote Vayam Shema before Shema, that would be okay. That's an actual halachic deya. So kesidran is an interesting topic which we'll get to later. So let's look at the Gemara. Sefer Torah shebala tefillin shebalu eino sin mehen mezuzah lefi she'en roidim mikdusha chamra kdusha kala. So the context of this Gemara is that this is toward the end of Bet Amud Aleph, and toward the end of Lamed Aleph Amud Bet begins a discussion about the parshiot of mezuzah, if they're written as stumot or if they're written as ptuchot. So just a quick reader about what that means. I have a sample from Torah that I'm writing, or actually, mostly written. And here we have a sample of, I picked this page because it has both. Here we see that this parsha ends with the word hayor, and then there's this open space. Ooh. Not sure how that happens. And we continue on the same line. So that means that the parsha ended with hayor is a parsha stuma. And by contrast, this parsha, which ends with hayor, we leave an open space all the way to the end. and begin on the next line. So it means that this parsha here that ended with Hayor, that's a parsha ptucha, right? Because it's open. The parsha is open at the end. So there's this discussion in the Gemara about whether or not one needs to write their mezuzot with parshayot stumot ptuchot. So Gemara is brought here in continuation of that discussion.
This is
just a second.
This is the Machloket Rambam
Yes?
and the Rosh, right?
Well, no, it's actually not the Machloket between the Rambam and the Rosh. The Machloket between the Rambam and the Rosh is how you make about the tzurot of the parsha. But there isn't a Machloket about whether or not you're supposed to write parshayot stumot for the mezuzah. But the two tzurot that I gave you, those are the tzurot that the Rambam and the Rosh agree. They both agree on those tzurot that the first one was a stuma and this one was a ptucha. Their machloket we'll get into later in Siman Lamed Bet, but basically it's a question of what happens if you don't have enough room to leave open to form that surah, and you have to go into a next line. So I'm gonna leave that because it's actually not immediately relevant. So at this point in the Gemara where we're at, the Gemara wants to assume that it's come to the conclusion that mezuzot are stumot. Both parshiyot are stumot, but if you make them ptuchot, it will be kosher. Just a second, I lost my screen. Here we go. They would both be kosher. So the Gemara actually, right before the introduction to this Breita is Lema Messiah. Right? So that this Breita is going to support that notion. Sefer Torah Shabbalah, Tefillin Shabbalu, Ein Osin Mehan Mezuzah, Lefi She'en Moridin Mikdusha Chamura Lekdusha Kala. So, as we said, a Sefer Torah that got worn out, or tefillin that got worn out, we don't cut out their parshiyot to form a mezuzah from them, because that would be a horada b'kedusha. And Rashi says, Kedushatam chamurat, tefillin kedusha is greater than a mezuzah, sheyesh behen arba parshiyot. So that's the reason it's a greater kedusha, because there's actually more there, right? The tefillin has the same parshiyot as mezuzah, plus two more, so it makes push. So in this, the Gemara asks, Ha moridin osi. So if we in fact would be allowed to lower the kedusha of the tefillin or the Sefer Torah, would we still be able to make a mezuzah from that? Amai, why would we be able to? Hacha stumot, v'hacha ptuchot. Because here, hacha stumot, here in the Sefer Torah, there's stumot, v'hacha ptuchot b'mezuzah. Here, you wanted to say right before this that we could also make them ptuchot. So how could you do it? Because with the parshiyot of mezuzah, in other words, Shema and V'hayayim Shemoah, both of those are stumot in the Sefer Torah. And here you want to say that if I make them ptuchot, it would be kosher. Ela Shema mina b'mezuzah nami stumoteng. And I could do it, achas stumot v'hacha ptuchot. Ela shema mina b'mezuzah nami stumoteng. This, in other words, Hamoridin osin, right? If I would be allowed to take the parshiot, which are stumot, and make them into a mezuzah, it means that mezuzot must be made of parshiot stumot, and they wouldn't be able to write v'hachab tuchot. And this, according to you, according to the dayah that the Gemara brought just before this, you could make them tuchot, but it wouldn't work, right? In other words, your mezuzah then wouldn't be kosher because they would be tuchot. I'm not sure if I'm making sense about this. So tell me if I said that right, because again, I'm a little foggy.
No, makes sense.
Makes sense. Okay. All right. The deal. So right. So I'll just read Rashi again. Hacha stumot. The Sefer Torah they're stumot. V'hacha ptuchot. You want to say they're ptuchot in the mezuzah. Ela shma mina. Rather, this implies the mezuzah nami stumoten. This would imply that in a mezuzah the parshiot must also be stumot. So the Gemara says Dilma lahashlim. So the Gemara says that's not a proof that the mezuzah has to have parshiot stumot, because maybe he didn't take out the entire parshiot, but maybe he just took one line or a couple of lines that he appended to. So let's say he had a mezuzah that was almost finished, and then he cut 2 lines off of the Sefer Torah and sewed them on, attached them to the bottom. Hold on a second. Dilma lahashlim, Dilma hadadaikinan hamuridino sin shim chisra mitfilin mezuzah. Right? Maybe that dayek, that if we would read in Kedusha, we would be able to make a mezuzah. Maybe it's talking about he took away part of the tefillin to finish off the mezuzah. So the conclusion then is that I don't have a proof from the Braita that mezuzot have to be mot. In other words, that's the thing that the Gemara is concerned about. Right? So Gemara is going to go on. It's going to say, I have another question though. Linda, you're just joining us. We're in the middle of this. You'll pick it up, but I'll because it's a little bit tricky. It's okay. I'll just go back and I'll point out. We're talking about this Braita here, and this Braita says Sefer Torah that was worn out, or tefillin that were worn out. Ein osin mehen mezuzah. So you can't, let's say, cut out the parshiot from the Sefer Torah or the parshiot from the tefillin and stick them together to make a mezuzah. The reason you're not allowed to do it is because the Sefer Torah is of a higher kedusha, and I'm not allowed to take something of a higher kedusha to use for something of a lower kedusha, like mezuzah. Okay, so the Gemara, you'll go back on the recording, you'll hear the first part. The next part, the Gemara asks questions on this. This is ha-moridin osin, and what if we were allowed? It's a kind of a counterfactual question. You're allowed to lower the kedusha from the parshiot of the tefillin or the mezuzah. Would we do it? Osin? We does that imply that we would? In other words, the Braita, only one reason why you're not allowed to do this. The only reason you're not allowed to take parshiot from Torah or tefillin to make them into a mezuzah is because it's a horadah b'kedusha. So that's the question of the Gemara. Ha moridin, and what? If I could be morid in kedusha, I would do it. But I learn in another Braita, halacha l'Moshe miSinai. tefillin al klaf, mezuzah al duchsustus. Klaf b'makom basar, duchsustus b'makom se'ar. So I learn elsewhere that it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai that tefillin have to be written on klaf, and mezuzah be written on duchsustus. Moreover, when I'm writing on klaf, I'm writing b'makom basar. I'm writing on the part that's near the flesh, and duchsustus b'makom se'ar. When I write on duchsustus, I write on the part that's near the hair. And so, what's the kasha? Why is this problematic for us? Right? Because a moment ago I can't take. Let's say we'll talk here. It's going to focus in between tefillin and mezuzah. Focus in also. I can't take the parshiot of tefillin that are the same as parshiot mezuzah and make a mezuzah from them, because I'm not allowed to be morid b'kedusha. So the Gemara says, and if I could be morid b'kedusha, could I do it? In other words, I can't. Because why? Because the tefillin would have been written on klaf, and the mezuzah needs to be written duchsustus. So that's another reason, right? In other words, so the Braita seems to be missing this reason. Like, try to focus only on horada b'kedusha. I have another very simple reason why I can't do it, because the tefillin would have been written on klaf, and I have to write my mezuzahs on duchsustus. So the Gemara answers lemitzvah. The Gemara says, this Braita that tells us that tefillin have to be written on klaf, to be written on duchsustus, that's the mitzvah. In other words, that's the best way to do the mitzvah, but it's not ma'akev. It doesn't hold back the mitzvah if I did it otherwise, implying that if I took the parshiot of mezuzah, tefillin that were written on klaf, and I turned them into a mezuzah, even though that mezuzah would now be a mezuzah on klaf, it would be kosher. So it wouldn't be the mitzvah, it wouldn't be the best way to do the mitzvah, but it would still be kosher. And so that's why this is proof against our basic contention that the reason you can't take parshiot from tefillin to make them into a mezuzah is because of horada b'kedusha. But it's not because one was written on klaf and one I write on duchsustus. Right? Rashi here just says, klaf kotvin alav b'makom basar, alma tefillin i afshar la'asota mezuzah. Right? So it teaches us that tefillin you can't make them into a mezuzah. Daha al haklaf nichtavu, because they were written on klaf. Mishane, and the Gemara answers the mitzvah. Mitzvah tefillin al haklaf, mezuzah aduchsustus. The mitzvah of tefillin is to be written on klaf, and mitzvah of mezuzah is to be written on duchsustus. About Shina, that if you changed that and you wrote the mezuzah on klaf, ein bekach klum. There's nothing wrong with that. Hilkach im moridin osim. Therefore, if we were to be able to lower the kedusha, we would be able to make a mezuzah from tefillin. Right? But the Gemara goes on. I have another Braita. Shina pasul. If you change it, it's pasul. So this Braita, which is just one word, right? Or it's just two words, shin sul, seems to be it's like the continuation of the Braita, right? So after it's kaf makom basar duchsustus b'makom se'ar, shina pasul. It says if you change it, it's pasul, right? So that undoes the teirutz of the mitzvah, because it's not just the mitzvah. the Breita says that it's part of the halacha l'Moshe Sinai that you're not allowed to change and write tefillin on duchsustus or mezuzah on klaf. So the Gemara answers, but tefillin. Actually, that only applies to tefillin. So when it says shina pasul, it means that tefillin ala klaf, and if you change that, that's pasul. But if you change to write mezuzah on klaf, that would still be kosher. Because that shina, the shinui, only applies, the shinui that's pasul, only applies to tefillin. And Rashi says, "V'hatanya shina pasul b'tefillin kamayri." And the Gemara answers, it's talking tefillin. Din katvana duchsustus pasul. That if you wrote your tefillin on duchsustus, that's pasul. Ava mezuzah aklaf shapir dami. But if you wrote mezuzah on klaf, that would be okay. Gemara doesn't give up. The Gemara says, Tanya shina bezeh bezeh. Vein bazel, vein bazeh, pasul. The Breita continues, or else this was another keta of the Breita that's appended to this Breita. It says, if you change whether this or this to this, it's pasul. It sounds like whether you change the tefillin to write them on duchsustus, so whether you change mezuzah to write them on chaf, both of those instances are pasul. And why is that a problem? Because if that's true, then I would not be able to ever make mezuzah from tefillin, because if I change the mezuzah to make it on klaf, it would be pasul. So Gemara answers, idi v'idi b'tefillin. Both of those shinuyim, both of these shina bein bazeh, vein bazeh, the bein bazeh, vein bazeh, they're both talking about tefillin. V'hadechatvinhu aklaf b'makom se'ar, v'hadechatvinhu aduchsustus b'makom basar. So I have two changes that apply just to tefillin. So it says, shina bein bazeh, if you changed to write the tefillin on klaf b'makom se'ar, or if you wish to write the tefillin to write them on duchsus b'makom basar. Both of those changes only apply to tefillin. So tefillin, so what comes out to this understanding is tefillin can only be written on klaf b'makom basar. It can only be written on klaf b'makom basar. And if you changed, if you did differently to write the tefillin, even if you wrote them on klaf, but you wrote them on klaf b'makom se'ar, or if you wrote them on duchsustus b'makom basar, in other words, even though, why does it say b'makom? If you write them on duchsustus at all, it would be pasul. But they say b'makom basar because you might think because the chatchila I write tefillin on klaf b'makom basar, maybe I could write them on duchsustus b'makom basar. So no, that however you change it, it's pasul. And so there, why? I still don't have a raya. So in other words, I still go back then to my original contention that the only reason that I can't make a mezuzah from old tefillin is because of horadah b'kedusha, but not because the parshiot are stumot, and not because I can't write a mezuzah on klaf. And if you want, I will say, in other words, I will give you I can explain this second Breita, or the third Breita, in a slightly different way. Shina bezeh bezeh tanaihi. That's actually a machloket. Right? When the Gemara says tanaihi, means it's a machloket tanaim. Titania. Because I have a Breita that says shina bezeh bezeh pasul. If we change this or this, it's pasul. Rabbi Acha machshir, mishum Rabbi Rabbi Chanina, V'amri la mishbi Akiva b'Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Acha was altogether machshir if you were to change. So in other words, I can go back to a simpler meaning of shina b'zeh b'zeh, which I could say that means if I change to write the mezuzah on klaf, or if I change to write the tefillin on duchsustus, both of them are pasul, and that's according to the Tana Kama. But according to Rabbi Acha, they would be kosher. I could change on either direction, and it would be kosher. And so it means, again, according to this teirutz, according to Rabbi Acha, the only reason I can't make a mezuzah from tefillin is because of Horodah B'Kedusha, but not because the tefillin were written on klaf, because Rabbi Acha is machshir if you write a mezuzah on klaf. And now we get to the part that's most pertinent to what we're learning right now. But the stuff that we just learned a moment ago, we're going to get into, I think, already in the next week or two, because that has to do with the differences between klaf, duchsustus, and gvil. So Gemara has yet another approach to this, dinosin, and so you still want to say since the only reason I can't make a mezuzah from tefillin is because I'm not allowed to be morid biktusha, but ha moridin. But if I would be morid biktusha osin, you're saying I could make a mezuzah from tefillin. Ha bayas sirtut. It needs sirtut. The Amar of Rav Manyume Bar Chilkia, Amar Rav Chama Bar Guria, of Kol mezuzah she'ina mesurtet psula. Any mezuzah that doesn't have sirtut is pasul. Rav Minyamin Bar Chilkia Didei Amar, so that the first one, Rav Minyami Bar Chilkia said in the name of Rav Chama Bar Guria, in the name of Rav, that mezuzah without sirtut is pasul, and then he said it. Then he said another thing on his own, that what sirtut shel mezuzah halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Mezuzah needs sirtut from because basically we have it as halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So in other words, he had a tradition that mezuzah has to have sirtut because it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai. And so what's the kasha? It's that hamoridino sin, if I were to be able, if the only reason I make a mezuzah from tefillin is because of horodah b'kedusha. So let's set that aside. And now you're saying there's no other reason that I can't make a mezuzah from tefillin, but I have another reason that I couldn't do it. The other reason is because the mezuzah has to have sirtut. And tefillin do not have to have sirtut, right? In other words, that's the implication. Ha bai sirtut. The mezuzah needs sirtut, and Rashi says k'deva faresha kaman, as it explains further on. In other words, explains right after. Uv'tefillin lo ashkechan de bai sirtut. And tefillin don't find that it needs sirtut. In other words, I don't have any source that tells me that tefillin have to have sirtut. And so the implication is I couldn't make a mezuzah anyway from tefillin because the tefillin min hastam won't have sirtut, but the mezuzah that I want to make from that does have to have sirtut, and it won't have the sirtut. So the Gemara answers Tanaihi. It's actually a machloket Tanaim. That question is in machloket Tanaim. Titanya Rabbi Yirmiyah Omer Mishum Rabbeinu. Tefillin and mezuzah nichtavot shelo tav. First of all, tefillin and mezuzah can both be written not copying from another written copy. Ve'ein tzrichot sirtut, and neither of them have to have sirtut. They don't have to. So that's not the conclusion. That's not the halachic conclusion, but that is a de'ah. Tefillin mezuzah nichtabot shalom nechtav. That is halacha. But ein sirtut, that's, so what we have is that that was a daya in the Tanaim. Rabbeinu would refer to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. The Hilchata, the Gemara though concludes the halacha, the psak halacha is, excuse me, tefillin lo bai sirtut. Tefillin don't need sirtut. And mezuzah bai sirtut. And mezuzah does have to have sirtut. But both mezuzah and tefillin can be written not from writing, or it's not from another written copy. Memtet, my ta'ama, what's the reason? Migras grisin, because they're well washed, they weren't very thoroughly. Whereas migras grisin, ruhutin heim befi kol, they are, they run from the mouths of every person, right? And it's that people are accustomed to knowing them and saying the time, so they don't make a mistake with them when they're writing them. Therefore, you don't need to copy them from another book or from another written copy.
Except that you make mistakes with your chaser and your malay if you're not extremely careful.
If you're not very careful, right? But the thing is, so I can tell you when I was learning to be a sofer stam, one of the things that I had to learn, and I was tested on it many times, is I had to learn all 4 parshiot of tefillin, which include mezuzah. I had to learn them for both chaser and malay. I had to learn them so that I could write them by heart, even though I never write them by heart.
No, I would never write mezuzah by heart. No, ever.
No, so it's not recommended. So that's the conclusion. I'll point out something interesting here, but I won't digress on it. So what's interesting here is this term, halacha l'Moshe Sinai, right? So the halacha l'Moshe Sinai means that this was a halacha that Moses received at night that was not actually written in the Torah, but same status as if it was written in the Torah. It means that it's considered to be a din d'oraita. It's considered to be a din d'oraita. And the Rambam says in his Takdamat to the Perush Mishnayot that anytime there's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, it means that there's no machloket. There's not a machloket. So what's interesting is here we see an example that seems to contradict that, right? Because Rav Yamin says this is halacha Moshe Sinai, but then I see that there's a braita that holds that mezuzah doesn't need sirtut, so there is a machloket. So in one of Rav Soloveitchik's shiurim, one of his published shiurim, he answered this question. This question is brought up among other places, the Chavot Yair, one of his tshuvot, and he said, and he brings up, there are a lot of cases where there is a machloket. This is one of them. There are many cases in the Gemara where there'll be a halacha Moshe Sinai, but not everybody agrees with the halacha. So what did the Rambam mean? How could he understand that to mean that there's no machloket? So Rav Soloveitchik answers, and he says what it means is once there was a reliable tradition that something was halacha Moshe Sinai. After that, from that time on, there was no machloket. It always went with whoever had the tradition that it was halacha Moshe Sinai, and that's also borne out here in our sugya, because it's tefillin lo bai sirtut, that stands. about mezuzah by a sirtut. Mezuzah still needs sirtut. And so according to this, the reason it needs sirtut is in fact because it Chalom Hashem Sinai. That's a little aside. So just to finish up, I'm going to go back and read this part in the Beit Yosef, and then next week we will pick up in the Beit Yosef. So here the Beit Yosef started off by saying, and here we're in Hilchot Tefillin, right? So he's talking about Tefillin, that you don't have to make sirtut for every line. And he brings this braita, B'tanya ba'kometz, Sefer Torah Shabbat Tefillin shebelo ein osin mehem mezuzah, lefi she'en moridim mikdusha chamura l'kdusha kava. Right, so that's the braita at the beginning of the sugya that I brought. Uparich, and the Gemara asks a kasha. He skips the intermediary parts that I did, and he goes straight to the last part. Ha mosin, v'ha mezuzah bai sirtut. Right, and what? And if you would be able to make a mezuzah from tefillin, in other words, if we were allowed you to be morid b'kedusha, does that mean you could make a mezuzah from tefillin? The mezuzah needs sirtut. And the implication being that the tefillin that you would be taking them from were not mesurtat. V'katvu atot, v'im tomar v'dilba b'mesartati. And if you'll say, the Gemara could have said, okay, ha-moridino sin b'misartate. In other words, that you could do it if the tefillin that you were taking them from already had sin. So why doesn't the Gemara say that? V'yesh lomar delo hayu regilin l'sartet sefer Torah tefillin. You could say it's that this indicates that they were not accustomed to making sirtut either in Sefer Torah or in Tefillin. Kevan de lo ba'u sirtut, because they don't need sirtut. Yerushalmi perakam de Shabbat. Kol patur min hadavar v'yosel nikra hediot. We learn elsewhere, not particularly in the context of not sirtut, but we learn in the context of another halacha. The Yerushalmi says anyone who is exempt from something and does it is called a hediot. So a hediot in this context means like bur v'ama aretz. He's like an unlearned person. Somebody, in other words, if you're machmir to be, the implication in our context is if you patur from doing sirtut, and you go ahead and do it anyway, you're here to do it anyway, you're a hediot. You're just an uneducated person. And the implication, the halachic implication is, you shouldn't do it. In other words, if you're patur from something and you do it, there's reason for you not to do it. This term hediot, it doesn't always mean that, right? Because it can also just mean a common person in contrast to a special person. So most famously, perhaps, we have the Kohen Gadol, and anybody who is not a Kohen Gadol is a Kohen Hediot, right? That's just a way of distinguishing between, for in halachic literature, we'll distinguish the high priest and all the regular priests. We call the regular priest a Kohen Hediot. So it doesn't always mean a stupid person or an uneducated person. But that's the implication here. Here it does mean that. And yes, it is the same Greek comes to mean in modern English, idiot.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that he's an idiot, but it means that he's uneducated. And the word idiot in English has its own interesting history, because in the early 20th century, it was actually a technical legal term in describing a person who had a certain mental status. And then we're going to stop here. we're going to talk more about the implications of kol patur min hadavar v'yasal nikra hadyot, and when that's applicable and when it's not applicable, or in other words, there are times it doesn't mean. I'll just say now, so I don't want to leave you with a particular conclusion. It doesn't mean that you're never allowed to be machmir, but in certain cases, you shouldn't machmir. And so the implication here is the reason Tosfos brings it is because, just to tie this up, Gemara implied hamoridino sina by sirtut. The Gemara implied that because mezuzah needs sirtut, I wouldn't be able to take parshiot from tefillin to make a mezuzah, because the tefillin wouldn't be misurtatim. So the Tosfos asked, "V'dilma b'misartate." Why doesn't the Gemara say, "Well, I could do it if the tefillin that you were taking them from were already, they themselves were misurtat"? The reason Tosfos says that the Gemara doesn't try to answer that way is yesh lomar delo hayu regilin l'sartet sefer Torah utfilin. The reason the Gemara doesn't even think is because they weren't accustomed to putting sirtut for sefer Torah or for tefillin. And why weren't they accustomed to? Because they didn't because they were patur from sirtut. And kol patur min hadavar v'yasal nikra hadyot, right? So in other words, the assumption is not that sometimes people did it and sometimes people did. The assumption is that people would never do it because they're patur, and there's reason not to do it at patur. So we'll stop here and pick up next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
See you next week. Bye.
See you next week. Have a good day. Good night.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.